times that he was right. He has ordered the National Weather Service to doctor its original forecast and claim that, yes, indeed, Alabama was supposed to be hit. He ordered the Secretary of Commerce to order the subordinates of and another government agency to do this, all for one line that he said that it might hit Alabama. Now, so this is Trump, and the circus of Donald Trump continues. But like the Roman circus, the danger is that we get distracted by it. To my mind, the themes, the really important themes that are taking place in the world right now, and Carl, you very intelligently summarized them very well. The real story that I think people will write about 20, 50 years from now is really of not just American, but Western decline. So that if you look 20 years ago, China was 1% of global GDP. Today it is 15% of global GDP. If you look at the so-called emerging markets, 25 years ago they were 4% of global GDP. Today they are 44% of global GDP. That is the big story. And the big story is about the rise of what I call the rest. You know, from about the 1600s, you have had the rise of the West. And the West rose because of the scientific revolution, because of the political revolution, because of the economic revolution, and thus the industrial revolution. The rest is rising because there has been a massive diffusion of knowledge. It started with Japan, the first country, non-Western country, to copy the West. But now you are at the point where there are billions of people around the world who are in societies that are rising and thriving. This is going to reshape the world. This is the big trend line that we should all recognize to reshape the world. The most powerful political reality of it is exactly what you said, Carl, the rise of China. Because 1.4 billion of those people happen to be in one country, and that country has grown faster than any large society in human history. To give you some sense of perspective, the West industrialized, Western Europe industrialized at about 2% growth per year. The United States, which is considered the crazy growth, super growth story of the 19th century, grew at 2.5%. China has grown at an average of 9.5% a year for 40 years. No country, we've never seen anything like it before. So when people say it may not go on, etc., it doesn't matter. The past 4 decades.
Democracy. And I am of the opinion that long term, free societies, messy as they can be, India is certainly a messy place, have better possibilities for long-term growth. So India, on present trends, is going to have an economy the size of Europe within 3 or 4 decades. The size of Europe. Others are growing. If you have India, Indonesia, Japan, they will be a bigger economy than China, balancing China to a certain extent. But then the development coming thereafter is, if you look south from us, go back to the year 2000, not that long ago, at least I remember what it was. At that time, the population of Africa and the population of Europe, minus Russia, probably minus Ukraine as well, by the way, EU, Europe, was a 500 million people. Same. Africa and EU, 500 million people each. We are not that. They're growing, the 54 countries of Africa are growing very fast. By the end of this century on present trends, 40% of working age population of the world will be in Africa. 40% of everyone of working age will be in Africa. The biggest city in the world will be Lagos.
A number of very interesting issues, and so let me, for purposes of conversation and discussion, but also because I do believe it, push back on a few ideas that you threw up. Is China going to be compatible with this world order that we have?
there is generally a mood now, not just in the United States, but in the West, that Carl's answer is the one to give, probably not. And I would push back on that by saying China has benefited enormously from this existing world order. It has grown rich under this existing world order. It is well aware that it has grown rich under this world order. And it has changed a lot from being a spoiler to a supporter. Let me remind you that when Nixon and Kissinger went to China to open China to the world, Mao's China was the single largest rogue state in the world. It was funding revolutions across the world, from Latin America to India. It was ideologically opposed to everything about the world order, which is why Mao very famously said once to Nehru, I would welcome a nuclear war, because half the world would be killed, but the other half could then become socialist. Now this gives you a sense of Mao's mentality. Flash forward to today. China is the second largest funder of the United Nations after the US. It is the largest funder of UN peacekeeping. It provides more troops for US peacekeeping than the rest of all the other permanent members of the Security Council put together. But you may say it is a trade cheat. It engages in unfair trade practices. There's some truth to that. But to put it in perspective, all countries with large economies tend to be somewhat abusive of the trade system because they know that you want access to their market. So Credit Suisse did a report in 2015 on the number of non-tariff barriers to trade put in place by countries. The number one country to implement non-tariff barriers in the world with 450 violations was the United States. Second, by the way, is Russia, third is India, fourth is Brazil, China is fifth or sixth. There are issues with China. Some of them are very traditional developing country issues, intellectual property. The United States did not respect intellectual property until it began to produce intellectual property, and then it began to respect it. China has been similarly abusive of intellectual property until a few years ago, when it put in place an intellectual property court in Beijing. There have been 63 cases brought in that court by Western companies. The court ruled in favor of the Western companies 63 times. Why? Do you know what the largest single company to file patents in the world last year was? The Chinese company Huawei. So China is now producing intellectual property and therefore is more respectful of these rights. All of which is to say, I think we also have to recognize that a rising China will have to be accommodated. It will not be the same as the system we have now. There cannot be a process in which a country that is now 15% of global GDP, for example, has no say in the IMF, no say in the World Bank on the scale that the Dutch, the French, and the Swedes have. When the time comes to appoint managing directors of the IMF and presidents of the World Bank, that is a European-American club. And it was natural that the Chinese will say, we want a stake there too. It is even natural, and maybe more provocative, and say they are going to have some control over their external environment. Whether that island in the South China Sea is too far or too much, I don't know. But I will point out that when the United States was not even in the top 10 economies in the world, it declared a Monroe Doctrine, in which it said no European power can come anywhere near the Western Hemisphere, the entire Western Hemisphere. Imagine if China made a proclamation like that today. So we have to also recognize that there will be a natural assertiveness from China. Second point I would just make, as somebody who grew up in India, India will take a long time to develop on the scale that China does. India is now finally growing a little bit faster than China, but the Chinese economy is 5 times larger than the Indian economy. It will take a long time for that compounding to make a difference. India's democracy, and this is a point that, Carl, I know you think a great deal about, is truly one of the marvels of the world, one of the poorest countries in the world that has been an open democratic system. but it is under threat from the same forces of populism and illiberalism that are affecting the West. You have in India a very popular Prime Minister whose government persecutes minorities, backs the courts, intimidates the media, and rewrites history. That's not the only part of the story. There are positive elements to it, but there is this systemic illiberalism. And one of the challenges I think we all wonder about with democracies is, are we going through a bad phase? Will there be a rebound? Or are some of these trends more permanent? When you look at Orban in Hungary, his ability to have amended the constitution, to have really changed the structure of political life in Hungary, worries me a great deal. And finally, my only point about Africa is, you're absolutely right. 1 out of every 3 people at the end of the 21st century will be African. And in a strange way, you know, human life began in Africa, and it is ending with an African-dominated world.
That's where we are. And the lesson, as I think we agree with, is that when you have major shifts of power relationship in the world, then the international system changes. Because every big rise in power demands not only a seat at the table, fair enough, but also want to assert itself. And the more powerful it is, the more it wants to assert itself. The United States has referred to the Monroe Doctrine. I'm not quite certain that the Mexicans have always found the United States to be the most comfortable of neighbors. It's always like this. And Russia, the rise of Russia is not something that we need to go into too many details here. Now we have China, then eventually the others. But the essence of what both of us are saying is that the global order, insofar as there is a global order, is going to be less order and more change, and there's more uncertainty in the years to come. But as I said, I saw my task less as talking and less as trying to stimulate you to put questions or objections or whatever. This is something which starts with you then.
Okay, thank you for a beautiful lecture. My name is Andrei Petrov, and I want to ask you about relations between China and Russia. You probably know that Russia has given hundreds of hectares of arable land to China, and from the Chinese board it is underpopulated, and from the Russians board it is overpopulated lands. So how do you think how this trend will be developed in future? And is there any threat to Russian territory in Far East, to Russian territory? Thank you very much.
It's a very, very interesting question. What is going on between Russia and China is absolutely fascinating. So you have in the large parts of the border, as you described, the borderlands, you have underpopulated Russia bordering overpopulated China. So essentially the Chinese are repopulating those areas, and of course the result is they are becoming Chinese. De facto, even if not de jure, those areas are becoming populated by the Chinese, owned by the Chinese, controlled by the Chinese. Now Russia has lots of land, but it will cause a significant change in the nature of the relationship. Russia and China have never been equals as great powers. For much of the 20th century, Russia was the senior partner, and ever since 1917, it was the dominant partner. People forget, but the entire experience of Chinese communism started out very much as a subordinate power to Soviet communism. Chinese communist leaders were sent to Russia, they were taught Russian, they were taught to model themselves after Russia. And then of course, the most significant feature of Mao's relationship was the break with Russia. And then the Sino-Soviet split really is what propelled China to enter the modern world and to ally with the United States. People often forget the real motivation for China to move toward the United States was the Sino-Soviet split, the desire to move away from Russia. So there has always been tension. And now what you are watching is a China that is on the rise and a Russia that is on the decline. And to my mind, that is the single most important part of this, the answer to your question. What is the nature of Russian decline as it continues? Because right now, it is quite significant. You have a Russia that is declining economically, that is declining in terms of things like life expectancy and general well-being, and that is propping itself up with a certain amount of geopolitical maneuvering, but mostly as a spoiler. It's a very worrying situation in general. If you think about Russia, it reminds me of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I. People often think that World War I was caused by Germany and the rise of Germany. But in fact, the immediate cause of World War I was a declining Austro-Hungarian Empire that decided it had to prove to the world that it was still powerful. And so when it faced a Serbia that it felt had assassinated its archduke, it decided to punish it punitively by declaring war on it in a very vengeful way. And then the great mistake that Germany made was to give a blank check to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the motor that caused the outbreak of World War I was the weakness and decline of Austria-Hungary. And if you look at Russia today, the search for external enemies, the search for some level of disruption, these things remind me a great deal of that process. So if that continues, I think Russia will face a real challenge, because the Chinese are expecting a new relationship with Russia, I believe, in which they are the dominant partner, in which they are it is a reversal of the relationship between Stalin and Mao, in which the Chinese are the leading power and the Russians the subordinate power. It might not look quite like that today because of President Putin, but once President Putin leaves, you will have a Russian figure of much lesser significance. And that reality will produce, I think, a very different dynamic. So I would suspect that in the short term, there is a possibility of making this alliance because they say they are against the United States and they are against certain kinds of Western norms, human rights and things like that. But in the long run, there will be a great deal of tension between these two countries.
I'm going to put out one small fact that I've been seeing in Moscow. The Russian economy is significantly smaller than the economies of the Chinese province of Guangdong and a lot of provinces in Russia. Is someone there?
Yeah, you.
Microphone there.
My name is Rina and I study international relations. My question is about hybrid war. Informational attacks are an essential part of it. What do you consider to be the most effective way in terms of fighting Russian propaganda, both against Ukraine and against the US? Thank you.
The question for those who didn't hear is, what can one do about hybrid wars, about what is the best way to confront them? So the notion of hybrid war was actually coined and described by the former Russian Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov. And his point was that in today's world, you have the possibility to attack your enemy in a much more creative way than you used to in the past, because you can send in troops that you claim are not troops. You can do cyber attacks that you can claim are not yours because they are difficult to source. You can spread misinformation that confuses and confounds the enemy. And it has proven very difficult to find a way to respond to it. I think that the best example of how to respond to it, and I'd love to hear what Carl has to say, is what the French did in their last election. The French were very alert to any foreign interference. They named it immediately, French media were very alert and attentive to when it was happening. They announced it immediately. I don't think you can do more than alert the public that it is happening. I think that piece of it, one has to believe in free societies that by providing greater transparency, you affect it. But it gets at this larger issue, which I think is there are two fundamental issues that you raise with hybrid war. One is that it is very difficult to fight an enemy that refuses to be identified. You know, traditionally in war, the reason people wore uniforms was quite literally so that each side could identify, so that you knew who was a soldier and who was a civilian. When you have a situation where the attacker doesn't want to identify themselves, doesn't want to be named, it's not even like a terrorist. A terrorist organization, the old rule about terrorism was you want a few people dead and a lot of people watching, because we were trying to convey your message. But the Russian attacks are even more complicated. They are simply designed to sow doubt and confusion and disruption. What do you do about that? How do you respond when the enemy is unseen and is difficult to find? You know, literally in the sense of the people not wearing uniforms, metaphorically in the sense of not knowing where the computer attacks come from. The best thing you can say is you try to strengthen your defenses, and that's true, and people are trying to do that. But it's much, much harder than one thinks, and you're doing, and all I can say is that becomes one of the key new dimensions of military response and military defense is this cyber defense. The second point I'd make is that the reason these kind of attacks work is because Western societies are divided, and perhaps more divided than they have been in a long time. The crucial reason why some of these efforts have worked is because, I don't know if it's half the population, but a significant part of the population, whether it's in Europe or in the United States, is so opposed to the other side politically that they would rather take implicit or explicit help from a foreign power. I think that would have been difficult to imagine in a different world. That division, the biggest genius, if you will, of the Russian attacks was to take advantage of this division within Western societies. And until we heal that division, I think it's much harder to have a resolute response. But I'd like to know what Carl thinks.
I agree with everything you said. Yes, add the fundamental fact which you alluded to, that the best defense ain't necessarily military. The best defense of any society is the strength of that particular society, of that particular state. If you have a coherent society and a functioning state, you have small green men appearing, you send the police and arrest them. But if you have a state on the verge of collapse and general disarray, which was what happened. Yanukovych had brought Ukraine into a state of political, financial collapse, state collapse. And when you have such a situation, when a society is divided or a state is disrupted, then you can move in fairly easily with these sorts of things that Putin did in Crimea and later in Donbass. But the resilience, solidarity, and strength of society and state, including, I agree with you, a free information space, where there is media and other that people relate to and rely upon. That is the best defense. And the ultimate defense against military aggression is always military. The best defense against a disorder is a good police force. But the best defense against sort of the more disruptive elements is to have a strong society, coherent society and a strong state, which Ukraine has made remarkable progress in building. Not down there, because otherwise it's
Mr. Zakariya, thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Ivan Gornyak, and as you know, China has its One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's become very active in promoting it in Europe. on one hand, we have Central European countries, and they even compete with each other to become a bridge or window for this initiative. And from another hand, we have some European countries that they are against this initiative. What do you think about this? Thank you.
So the question was on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which now, of course, extends all the way to Europe. I think that there is a tendency to view every Chinese action as being part of some kind of great master plan. The Chinese are these geniuses that they think, in centuries, and that they are building the plan for the next 1,000 years. I am a little skeptical of this kind of cultural generalization. I don't think the Chinese are necessarily more long-term thinking than people in the West. I think it varies from place to place and project to project. I'll give you one example to demonstrate this. There's a very famous anecdote that is told to describe the genius of the Chinese. And it is that Henry Kissinger once asked Zhou Enlai, the premier of China during the 1970s, he asked Zhou Enlai, "What do you think of the French Revolution, 1789? And Zhou Enlai said, after thinking for a moment, "It is too soon to tell." Meaning, 2 centuries have gone, but it is too, this is a perfect example of the Chinese long-term view. Well, we just have released the transcript of that conversation and the interpreter's notes. And it turned out what Henry Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai was, in 1973, "What do you think of the revolutionary events taking place in France?" Meaning the student protests that had taken place in 1968, 5 years earlier. And Zhou Enlai said, "It's too soon to tell," which is a perfectly natural, normal thing to say about something that had taken place just 5 years ago. So it's an illustration of the fact that don't believe everything that you hear about the Chinese. They have not got some master plan. If you look at the first phase of what wasn't then called the Belt and Road Initiative, but the Chinese went into Africa and Latin America, and they bought lots of oil, natural gas, copper facilities. When we look back in retrospect, they bought these at the height of the commodity boom. They massively overpaid for them. They found that the places that they went to were not functional, and so they had to send Chinese laborers in there, then they had to send Chinese military to guard the laborers. The whole thing has been quite a fiasco. And you might ask yourself, and Carl, I know you and I are both classical liberals, you could have bought that stuff. After all, when some African country has oil, they can't drink the oil. They have to sell it. When you have a copper mine, you have to sell the copper. The Chinese could simply have bought the copper instead of buying the mine. It may turn out to have been a very foolish investment. I'm old enough to remember when the Japanese were very rich and were buying Rockefeller Center in New York and Pebble Beach in California, this greatest golf course in America. And everybody in America thought this was a Japanese master plan to take over America. Well, it turned out they had too much cash, which made them stupid. They massively overpaid for all this, and they had to sell it back a few years later at half the price. So my point would be some pieces of the Belt and Road Initiative is many different things all put together. Some part of it is to deal with surplus capacity in China, particularly on the infrastructure front. Some part of it is to design to build economic influence with their neighbors. Some part of it is geostrategic. For example, they are trying to encircle India with a series of ports. They are financing ports in Burma, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and they have increasingly friendly relations with Nepal. So there you see a clear geostrategic objective there. Some of these will work, some of them won't work. I think it is much better to look at these on a case-by-case basis and ask yourself, does this particular project make sense? Does this particular, what is the motivation behind this particular project? In some cases it'll make sense for countries to cooperate, in other cases it won't. But, when governments go around the world spending vast amounts of money, in my experience, it does not always work out so well. So, the Chinese may look back 20 or 30 years.
Trying to have some geographical justice here. Gender and geographical justice.
Like a good Northern European, you're doing geographical balance, gender balance. Now you've got to do depth also. Back.
My name is Oksana. I'm a PhD student, and my question is the following: do you think the EU is declining too? And what is the future of Europe? And what's the role and place of Ukraine in the future construction of Europe, how it will be? Thank you.
As an outsider, as an American, I have to say one sometimes forgets to say how extraordinary the European experiment has been. The European Union is basically the most successful political organization in the history of the world. By which I mean, if you could put together countries that for 400 years have fought bloody wars against each other and somehow create a construction in which it is unthinkable that these countries would go to war, and in fact they cooperate so much that they are able to achieve some degree of common policy, even some common foreign policy, we think is a miracle. This would be really what we would want for the world, right? And so, first I start by saying it's an extraordinary achievement. I think it is fair to say it is in some trouble now. And I would argue that from my point of view, looking from the outside, and it's easy to say this in retrospect, the European Union, in my opinion, made two mistakes. It expanded too far too fast, and the single currency was adopted in a way that made it very difficult to succeed. Too far, too fast. I don't object to taking all these countries, but I think that the problem became it was very difficult to maintain conditionality. And many of these countries have not really reformed. And so if you look at a country like Romania, it is very difficult to make the case that they have really satisfied the criteria. But it becomes very difficult to stop that train once it's going. And how we manage this is difficult, but I think this was one of the key flaws. The second is, the euro is basically a mistake, in my view. You cannot have a single currency without a single fiscal policy, and that challenge is essentially impossible to solve. Europe is a very rich continent. You can make mistakes. It's like rich people. You can waste money, and you'll still be rich. It doesn't mean it was the right idea, and it will be very difficult to sort it out. But those two things, I think, have caused enormous amount of turmoil. To your final point, Ukraine's destiny lies with Europe. I don't say this as a political matter, I say this as a civilizational matter. And I think the most important thing for Ukrainians is to recognize that that is the lodestar, that is the guiding light that they should adopt, which is they want to be part of European civilization. They want to think in terms of European values. They want their companies to operate on European standards. They want their governments to treat people on the basis of European code of conduct and human rights. If you can achieve that, it becomes less important whether you are actually technically a member of the European Union or not. I'll give you one example. Turkey. Turkey thought it was going to be a member of the European Union. And for the first 5 years of Erdogan's presidency, it did historic reforms, more reforms than had taken place in the previous 30 years. The minute it thought it was not going to join the European Union, it began a downward spiral which has resulted in essentially an electoral dictatorship in Turkey and the complete collapse
collapse of that democratic process. That is a terrible mistake. The Turks will continue to do, it doesn't matter whether Europeans take us or not. And there were many Turkish liberals, including politicians, including the first president of Turkey in this case, who very much believed that. I remember President Gül once said to me, I don't care if the Europeans ever take us. I just don't want them to say no. Because as long as it's ambiguous, I can keep pushing reform through in my country. So I think that the goal for Turkish and for Ukraine should be that it modernizes itself
with Europe as its guide, whether or not the ultimate destination is the European Union, because the truth is, Ukraine will become a rich, prosperous, and free society, and at that point, will it even matter? But my guess is by that point, the European Union will want Ukraine more than Ukraine will want the European Union.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Thank you for coming to Ukraine. My name is Anastasia. I study international relations and international communications. So my question is, if in the US election 2020 Democrats win over, will that affect China-US relations and will that affect the world order like in general? Thank you.
Will it affect China-US relations?
China-US relation and afterwards like the world order.
It's a very good question, because actually one of the interesting things to notice in this last couple of months with the trade talks between China and the US is that there was a moment at which President Trump was thinking of waiving certain tariffs, of reducing the tariffs he had put on China. And he got attacked immediately by the two senior-most Democrats in the US Congress, Senator Schumer and Representative Pelosi, the Speaker of the House. Because you now have a certain kind of bipartisan toughness on China, a sense that the Chinese took the United States for granted, abused the trading system, and they need to be stood up to. As I said, I myself think that some of this is an exaggeration, but there's no question that the Chinese have played fast and loose with the rules, more by the way, being very clever and inventive how they have manipulated the WTO system rather than by actually undermining it. If you go to the WTO in Geneva, you notice one of the largest buildings right next to it is the Chinese mission to the WTO, which I believe is larger than the next 10 missions put together. So they have hundreds of people there whose work it is to figure out how to, push the rules to their advantage. For that reason, I think that this is a larger issue than Republican versus Democrat, Trump versus not. I think that there is a much greater bipartisan feeling that the United States needs to be tough on China. And what I worry about is, what it means is, the opposition party is always going to say that the government was soft on China. So that if the Democrats come into power, and let's say they make a deal with China, you know what is going to happen. The Republicans are going to say, you sold out the country to China, you should have been much tougher, just as the Democrats are saying now with President Trump. In those circumstances, it becomes very difficult to pursue rational policy. It becomes very difficult to pursue a policy that is moderated and balanced. And my fear is that, of course, China has its own hardliners. And so there will be a kind of action-reaction spiral where US hardliners will embolden Chinese hardliners will embolden the US. Remember, there are people in the US who actually want a world that looks very different from the one today. Because if you wanted to destroy the so-called open global world system, the open economy, all these rule-based liberal institutions that dominate the world now, the easiest way is to have a cold war between the largest economy in the world and the second largest economy in the world. Now, somebody like Steve Bannon wants that, the ideological advisor to Trump. Some of the people in Europe, like Marine Le Pen, want that. Somebody like Nigel Farage wants that, because they believe this world of globalization and the European Union has produced too much globalism, and they want to break it down. But I think that a lot of people who actually believe in this order and have built it and created it are going along with it because they want to seem tough on China. And they don't realize this will destroy the thing that they have built. Because if you end up with a bipolar world of trade, of technology, where half the world is told you have to buy Ericsson and Nokia, the other half is told you have to buy Huawei, half the world is told you have to shop on Amazon, the other half is told you have to shop on Alibaba. It's a very different world than we were imagining. And it'll be a smaller world, it'll be a poorer world, and it'll be a world with greater conflict. So I, for one, think we should not be welcoming a road that would take us there, but rather trying to see how we can still integrate the various elements of the world into one cohesive system.
I get the sort of very firm instructions of a rather brutal and disappointing nature, meaning that our time is up. But I think we had a great ending, and thank you for coming. And for all of those of you who wanted to hear more, tune in to CNN. I can see your show at least twice a week, Lenny. Yeah, okay, that's a good advice. More to come, but it will be on television. Thanks.